right, welcome back to the podcast Rethinking Faith. Again, I'm Mitch Moyer. I'm your host. I'm followed by both of my amazing co-hosts, James Ballard and the one and only Ray Luke. And you guys doing good tonight, man?
Doing great.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Doing really good, man. How you guys doing, James, Mitch, man? How are the families? Everybody good?
Very
All
good.
right, great,
Big
man.
God.
Good. It's good to have you guys back again. And this is the first time we've done a part B. Okay. So we're going to, tonight, we're going to pick up with part B. So part one came earlier, part two tonight on our discussion of Sola Scriptura and the Oral Torah. I just want to say that after having listened to that first part myself, I came up with about 3 or 4 pages of notes that when we're done with this podcast, I want to sit down with both of you guys and have you explain some of that stuff to me because you guys were hitting some home runs there, and I just really appreciate the work that y'all put into it, and the research that goes into it is just absolutely amazing. Again, we're gonna pick up where we left off at with in the first half of the episode, and we're going to start off with a question, James and Ray. And that question is real simple. I think maybe we should do a bracelet after this, make a bracelet that we could sell. What would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? I used to have a yellow bracelet that had Live Strong on it when I was in my cycling days, for the organization that Lance Armstrong did for fighting cancer. He was a professional cyclist out of the States here. But I think what we should do is we should come up with another one. Maybe we could pick a different color and we could put on it, what would Jesus do? Huh?
I like it. I think we might get sued, but I like it.
Or they could come in various colors, I guess. All right. Um, what would Jesus do? Because again, we go back to the discussion of, we say things like all we need, or I hear this said a lot, is all we need is Jesus. Um, I'm a follower of Jesus. I follow his teachings. Um, Jesus is my rabbi. Some people will say that.
Yep.
But James, open us up, and what exactly would Jesus do? How would he know what to do? Where did he keep a book in his back pocket that gave him the instructions? What would he do?
It's a great question. And before we get into this, I want to make sure everyone takes the time and you kind of pause this if you haven't heard the first episode. In the first episode, I think we really started to hit on this at a high level. We defined some terms. What is Sola Scriptura? What's the oral tradition? We cited from the Torah itself the idea that there is an oral Torah. And I think now we have to ask, okay, so what would Yeshua do? What would Jesus do? Right? It really depends on how you understand him to be. And you guys have said this so many times, Jesus was Jewish. So that alone tells us what he would have done. And we see evidence of his obedience to the oral Torah all throughout the New Testament. And remember, as we said in the first episode, the New Testament didn't exist yet. And oral tradition was the only way teachings were shared. It was forbidden at this time to write down the writings of your teacher. So he not only believed and kept the oral tradition, he partook of that in teaching his students. And, there's a very powerful verse. We said this last episode. I think it really needs to be said again. Matthew 23:3. Yeshua says, the experts in the law and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you. Whatever they tell you, do and observe. But not the works that they do, for they preach, but they don't practice. So, I mean, to me, I've heard people spin that in some other ways that, they're hypocrites or whatever. I think the next verses kind of go into a rebuking of certain Pharisees. But if you look at the Clement homilies, we've mentioned this before. They're out there for free online. The 19th chapter, Clement, who is mentioned in Philippians, he's among the believers. He's actually mentioned in the New Testament. He kind of elaborates on this. He kind of amplifies this statement. And he says, therefore, he, Yeshua, made use of this memorable expression, speaking the truth with respect to the hypocrites of them, not with respect to all. For to some, he said that obedience was to be rendered because they were entrusted with the chair of Moses. However, to the hypocrites, he said, woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, and people are familiar with those verses. So he touches on something we said last week. He says, not all of them. For to some, he said, listen to them, render obedience because they sit on the seat of Moses. And if you remember the first verse of the Mishnah, it tracks the Oral Torah and the Torah all the way back to Moses at Sinai. And Clement is saying, in his amplified version, that's what Yeshua was teaching his own disciples. And I can't say that I know too many people today who follow those instructions all these years later. And of course, he's speaking about the Pharisees. Now, in a later rabbinic work, this is very common. This is a very common statement that we'll see. And so, Pesikta Rabbati, it's a work of Midrash. It says this in the third chapter: "Do not say, I won't obey the words of the sages, because they're not in the Torah. The Blessed Holy One says, no, my son, everything they tell you to do it, because it's written on the Oral Torah, which they will direct you." So it's very clear in the Jewish worldview, before, during, and after, and even still today, that there has to be this body of leaders who understand the wisdom that's been handed down to them so that they can properly discern and lead their people. And the reason this is because God gave us the Torah, but the Torah in no way encapsulates every experience in human life. And last week we covered the minimal things, the interesting things. We said astrological, how do you keep the time? How do you wash your hands? Do we have to wash our hands? Do we have to pray? How do we pray? Right, so things like that, basic things. Now I want to touch on some major gaps in the Torah. These aren't trivial things. These are big things, right? So the Torah is to be obeyed by the people of Israel. So they're asked to leave the edges of the fields before they even have fields in their possession. They're still a wandering people when they're told to leave the edges of your field. So how do you keep that? And of course, the elders and the oral tradition would have instructed them in principle how to keep that. Slaughtering. There's a verse where God says, slaughter the animal as I've commanded you. But, some commentaries have gone back and said there's no commandment in the written Torah of how to do that. How do you cut the good fat from the bad fat? Or how do you cut a certain animal a certain way, right? Like, how do you do that? So now we're talking about very specific, sacrifices and offerings are happening all the time. How do you do that correctly if it's not given to you in writing? Circumcision. This
Exactly.
is a major one. Circumcision, being a part of the kingdom for every boy. This is a commandment on the 8th day. And of course, Yeshua went through this himself. And the word orlah is ambiguous. It kind of comes, it's just kind of like, it's kind of the same root word for skin. And it's used times throughout the Bible. So in Genesis 17:11, the word, is given to us in the context of circumcision. And Abraham knew enough what that meant to circumcise himself. And, in another verse, we see in Exodus 6:12, it's talking about lips. Moses is talking about his speech, right? Jeremiah 6:10, it's talking about ears. Deuteronomy 10:17, it's talking about circumcision of the heart. And that's one that I think people are familiar with. And even that's a euphemism for the Yetzirah.
Yep.
Now, if we don't know exactly what that means in the Torah, because it's not very, what do we do? How do we solve that? This is circumcision. This is a big deal.
Yeah, because you could be cut off from the community for not being circumcised. So it's a big deal.
It's as big as it gets. Details for offerings. Again, we kind of touched on that, but there are a lot of different types of offerings. It's very technical. Try to go from the Bible into this yourself, and you'll realize there's a lot of information that's just not there for you. Shabbat, right? So we know Salafhad is, as his name is in the tradition, he's gathering sticks, and Moses doesn't exactly know what to do with them, so he has to go with Aaron to God in prayer and figure out what exactly do we do here. We don't actually have an answer for this. And that's another one. So kashrut, we talk about eating kosher. Some of the names of animals aren't very clear. So there are certain birds, we don't even know what these birds are. And the sages will admit, we don't know what that is. So they've done the best work they can through all of their wisdom handed down century after century, they really make good sense of these things. But if you're reading this, you won't know these things, even if you speak Hebrew. Things like tefillin and tzitzit, again, they're commanded. They're big commandments. In the Jewish world, we say prayers, and we do these every day. But there's really not a lot said about how you write them. There's not a lot said about how you make tefillin. This comes from the tradition. And, we could go on and on, but there's a really good one. And then, Ray, I want to take your thoughts on this as well. But Zechariah 8:19 gives us a really interesting biblical proof for the rabbinic authority. So in the verse, it says, the Lord of heaven's armies says, the fast of the 4th, 5th, 7th, and 10th month will become joyful and happy, pleasant feasts for the house of Judah. So love, truth, and peace. Now, when we pick this apart, it's going by the Jewish calendar, which is governed by the oral tradition. There are actually a few months, which are the first of the month, but the oral tradition sort of parses this out for us, so we know which months are the actual 4th, 5th, 7th, and 10th ones being spoken of here. And it says, these fasts will become joyful. So that must mean that they're not joyful now. And these, in fact, aren't. These are the 4th month is 17th of Tammuz. The 5th is Tish B'Av. That's the day when the temples were destroyed. The 7th month is Tzom Gedalia. That's when a governor was killed in Jerusalem. And 10th is a very interesting one for another show. It's the 10th of Tevet. And we just passed through that. So the rabbis have laid down these 4 fasts of commemoration, and they commemorate terrible events, sad events. But Zechariah is telling us that in the Messianic era, these fasts will become joyful when the Messiah comes and restores everyone in the redemption. It doesn't say, hey, those are rabbinic fasts, so if you feel like doing these, it's telling us keep these fasts because they're going to be meaningful in the future. But
Right.
these are not detailed for you in the Torah. Some of these are indeed rabbinic.
Yes, those are beautiful points, man. I mean, these type of details, I think, is what I needed. I mean, what I needed, and when I was in the beginning of my journey, and with some time, I began to, you have to be open-minded. You kind of come from a perspective of humbling yourself to the vast information that's out there, and you got to be willing to learn. I think that it's very interesting that, I mean, a lot of Christians, they would be so shocked and amazed to see that Jesus of Nazareth embodies what we know of the oral tradition even before it was codified. What do I mean? So Jesus lived during a time, and the Gospels record his words, maybe 150 years, 200 years before the rabbis codified what they knew as the Oral Torah to that time. Okay, they codified it at Yavne. But a lot of times you'll see quotes in the Gospels of Jesus saying stuff like, before you go to judge a man, take the log out of your own eye. I mean, this stuff is recorded by the sages in the Gemara, almost word for word, right? And so you say, there must have been a certain teaching during Jesus' day that was extant. Like we always talk, Mitch, that Jesus didn't, this stuff didn't fly out of thin air, that the Father Godhead threw into Jesus' head, and so he just came up with this stuff. No, I mean, I'm telling you that the word for word, the sages repeat exactly the same thing that Jesus has said on the Sermon on the Mount and other places, word for word. Why? Because this is part of the oral transmission that all learned, educated Jews knew about the Torah. They took it for granted that it was this way, especially during Jesus' day, that the Torah was literally oral. It was an oral tradition passed on from father to son.
Yeah.
Like that. And so, man, it's beautiful to see that, to see how Miriam comes to, she comes to the temple to bring Jesus and offer him up as the firstborn, right? And as and to give what the sacrifice to purify herself. How does she know to do that? Where does she get this from? You know, there's some information in the Torah, but the details, to be exact and to do it correctly, it only comes from the oral transmission.
That's a great point. I mean, Leviticus 12 is the chapter that deals with circumcision, and it only has 8 verses, and it's a very distinct chapter. And again, circumcision is a massive um, commandment. It's one of the biggest commandments, right? We see Paul circumcises Timothy, so it apparently didn't go away in the New Testament. It was still happening, and
Right.
Clement was apparently converted by Peter in the Clement homilies. So Peter was apparently still doing this. How did they learn how to do that? How did they learn the process? How did they know how to do that? How does this um, go forward? And so you'll see some things too. These holidays were these Moedim, these appointed times. These were a big deal. Paul continually keeps these. There's a verse I remember, Acts 18:20. I'll read a couple versions here because there's an interesting play in the translations that leaves a couple things out. But when you read it in, I believe it's the King James version here, you see it's put back in so people can understand that there's more being said here. So in Acts 18:20-21, Paul states he must observe the Passover at all costs in Jerusalem. And this troubles a lot of commentators because he's keeping a Passover, Paul still? I thought Paul converted, right? Why would he be keeping this Jewish custom holiday if he'd moved on? So the ESV says, when they asked him to stay for a longer period, he declined. But on taking leave of them, he said, I will return to you if God wills. And he set sail from Ephesus. The NIV says the same thing, a little bit different. But the King James, in the Greek, you can also see this. You see, it renders like this. When they desired him to stay longer with them, he consented not, but bade them farewell, saying, I must by all means keep this feast that cometh in Jerusalem. But I will return again unto you if God wills. And he set sail from Ephesus. So even in the New Testament, very popular English versions are leaving these verses out in certain places where it's evident that Paul, at all costs, it says, I must go back to Jerusalem and keep this feast. Wow, that's a big omission.
Amazing.
Right? And there are many of these. I'm sure we all have notes of these. So it really does come down to your perspective of who were these people. If they were Jews, that does mean something in an orthopraxic way. Their lives looked a certain way, and they were the proud bearers of this tradition, right? Everyone in a traditional society, it's not a burden if you grew up in a traditional society. It's an honor. You get to continually stand on the shoulders of the next generation, and one day you'll put your kids on your shoulders, right? And it goes up and up and up. It's not the way I think Western society has looked at this. I want to be fair because Eastern Orthodox Christianity is more traditional, and they do understand that, and they can trace back their teachings pretty far back, if not to the apostles. Of course, it's still Christianity in their way of doing it, but there are some remarkable similarities. But I think it's really the West that we're talking to in this, that has sort of walked away from these traditions. And, Mitch, going back to what you said in the beginning of the last week, you pick up the Bible and you read it. And then you eventually have to read somebody's commentary. But is it the one that the apostles were reading? Is it the one that Yeshua was teaching from? Because if it's not, it's really late in the game.
Yes. And I think Ray said something, he's mentioned this before, and it sticks with me because having spent, a certain amount of my time in the Christian theological realm, it takes a big chunk of humility to take a step back and go, hold on a moment. You look at things like you calling Yeshua a rabbi, understanding that he taught in the synagogue, uh, even that he went to Jerusalem for Hanukkah and other appointed times.
Yeah.
And just the idea, or just the saying of the appointed times and the impact of just reading over that, or just having somebody say that, but understanding why the appointed times are so important and where they came from. He taught from the Midrash in his teachings. Um, to link him back to that and to link him to that and then bring it, for me, it was like I began to read the Bible and then I had to go and understand the Bible in order to come back to pick up reading the Bible. And especially when it came to Yeshua, because we all, especially within the Christian world, when we begin this process of learning about him and learning about the teachings before we get to the letters of Paul, we have this idea about Jesus. We have this idea of like Ray says a lot of times, did this stuff just fall out of the air? Did he levitate around all the time? What was there, just all of this stuff that was going on? But then when you look at his life and the fact that, some of the earliest examples of traditions can be found in the Gospels, before the Mishnah, and that's like saying a blessing over the bread and wine, holding a Seder,
Yep.
Reciting the Psalms after a Seder, hand washing, there's just so many of these minute details that when you pull them out and you begin to look at them, you begin to really encapsulize who Yeshua is. And that to me was ridiculous. It twisted me so hard that I had to back up and back away from Paul's writings for a little while so that I could get a better understanding from people who knew Jesus better than some of the Christian theologians that I was studying from. And for me, that took a little bit of humility. That took a little bit of time to just take that step backwards and say all of that I had learned before, I'm going to have to back up a little bit from this and begin this as a brand new circle, as a brand new path.
Jesus says stuff like, they lengthen their tassels, to be seen by men. What is he talking about? How is it that he takes it for granted again that what you see, the fringes, the tassels on a religious Jew, right, is something that you're commanded to do by the law of Moses? Okay, he didn't say don't do it. He said that they were doing it in a certain way to be seen by men, right? Or when it says that the woman with the blood flow, it says that she you have to read it in the Greek, that she grabbed the tassels on him. He also wore them as a religious Jew. Okay, he wore those fringes that Christians think they're so weird when they see an Orthodox Jew, right? This is a commandment in the Torah given to Jewish people. All right. How do you figure this out? Where do you get this at? You can't figure it out from the written Torah, because the written Torah tells you, you should just put this on the corners of your garments. Put what? Put it how? You don't have those without an oral tradition. And like you said, Mitch, you brought up Hanukkah. Hanukkah is not one of the Moedim that you find in the written Torah. It's not. It is, and it is added by the sages as they saw that clearly God had done a miracle in their midst.
Yeah.
And sure enough, Jesus didn't say, hey, this is some type of man-made, you don't know that we follow Sola Scriptura? No, we find him in the temple celebrating with other religious Jews that situation that happened with the Maccabees, the Feast of Dedication, which is Hanukkah.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So, I mean, it's everywhere.
Yes.
I think there's one thing that we haven't touched on yet, and it's the idea that we've mentioned, and we're dancing around this, and it's going to have to be its own episode or two, but the undergirding of all of this oral Torah and this disputation and these arguments you see in the New Testament, this is what it's all about. And these disputations again, we've mentioned these two houses of Pharisaic thought, Hillel and Shammai. And in the century before Yeshua and Paul, a lot of these disputes were kind of left up in the air because the Jewish worldview isn't trying to tell you so much what to do. It's teaching you how to think so that you'll know what to do and you'll know how to do the right thing. And these arguments are sort of par for course in that. And, many times you'll see Hillel and Shammai. It's mentioned that, their arguments are for the sake of heaven. And at the end of the day, they're friends and they're still having food together in front of their students and they respect each other. These disputations are not Yeshua's apostasy from Judaism. And I think Jews and Christians need to know that, because I think a lot of people on both sides, they have this impression that Yeshua came and he did away with all things Jewish. But when you look at what's under the hood of the New Testament, you're really seeing these holes of thought, Hillel and Shammai type arguments all throughout the New Testament. And
it's beautiful.
Yeah, I think one of the things, we mentioned Hanukkah. So I'll give you a couple of examples here, just off the top of my head. Hillel and Shammai, they argued about how to light the candles. So Hillel would say, we light, right? He would say, we light 1 and we grow. And Shammai would say, we light 8 and we count down. And both of them are logical. Both of them are sensible. Which one do you choose? Now, later in normative Judaism, the side of Hillel would be taken. But at this time, Hillel's kind of looked at it from faith, right? So you see this idea that there's every night is a miracle, whereas Shammai saw it as you light the oil and it dwindles as you go down, right? So you get this idea that they're looking at it from two different perspectives. And Hillel kind of takes the side of, he has faith. Every night it gets stronger. The first night is just as powerful as the eighth night in terms of miracles. And what happens? The students of one take one side and the students of the other take the other, and they can battle between each other. But the reality is, light one candle. I think that, and they even state that's the mitzvah. Light one candle and you've fulfilled your obligation. I have one example, another one. So saying the Shema, right? So we see in the Gospels, someone comes to Yeshua and says, what's the greatest commandment? And he basically recites the Shema, the greatest prayer, even still said today, from the time of Moses to tonight, I'll say it. The Shema, right? It's Deuteronomy, and it's a very powerful staple of Jewish prayer. So they disputed over that. Shammai took a literal read and says one should recite it reclining at night and standing in the morning, because it says when you lie down and when you get up. And Hillel says one could recite in any manner they choose. And there's a really good story in the Mishnah. And this just goes to show you, I want you to see that Oral Torah is living and breathing, and you can take different sides. They want you to know how to think to do so. I'm not telling you, if you don't agree with this, you're not a Jew, or right? That's not what's happening. So here's what it says in the Mishnah, Brachot 1:3. The school of Shammai says, in the evening, all the people should recline and recite Shema. In the morning, they should stand. Since it says, in Deuteronomy 6:7, when you lie down and when you rise, the verse I just said. The school of Hillel says, each person may recite it in his usual way. Since it says, and when you walk on the road. If so, why does it say, and when you lie down and rise? So they're really going into the text here, right? This is typical rabbinic pastime. So one student says, Rabbi Tarfon, he says, I was traveling on the road and I reclined to recite Shema in accordance with the view of the school of Shammai. And by doing so, I put myself in danger of attack by bandits, right? In Israel, there are a lot of bandits on these roads. The Romans did a good job of policing them, but sometimes you would have these things happen. And you remember, Yeshua talks about this as well. Someone traveling and they're beaten, they're left on the side.
Yep.
So the other sages say to him, you would have deserved it. You were guilty of your own fate since you went against the school of Hillel. So they're saying he was guilty, or he would have been guilty of his own fate for saying the Shema the way Shammai said, not Hillel.
The school of Shammai, yeah.
And it just goes to show you that these disputes were normal. And that was really the context. And what Yeshua is doing, he's debating oral Torah within the ecosystem of a Jewish worldview. At no point is he walking away from that. If he's a rabbi, like we said, we just said this, Mitch. He was a rabbi. He was reading in the synagogue. He was teaching in the temple area. He knew the holidays. If he was all of these things, he would have been in these debates, right? So I just want people to know that this oral tradition, it's not supposed to be easy. It's not supposed to be clear, right? That's not how it works here, and that's not the purpose of life. Trying to boil everything down to a systematic theology really leads us far astray. And there's a quote from Daniel Lancaster, and he really just comes out with it. He says, Jesus was not a Sola Scriptura Protestant, nor was he a Sadducee. Instead, he commanded his disciples to heed the authority of the Pharisees, a fact attested to by every reliable manuscript of the Gospels.
I mean, that is just amazing. It's just amazing. And I'll go back to my point that I made earlier, that Jesus lived in a time where the oral Torah was not codified, meaning it had not been written down, right? But the schools existed in his day. And when I say schools, I mean the two schools of the Pharisees. They existed in their day, the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. Shammai may have even still been living, according to some scholars, okay? But what's really interesting is that during Jesus' day and during the day of the apostles, the popular school was the school of Shammai, okay? And so we hear later on that, like as you quoted, James, that the words of Hillel and the words of Shammai, though they had disputes, are the words of the living God. Okay. This is according to the Talmud, okay? They say this, that the Shammai was a great holy sage, and so was Hillel, right? The dispute was more so like this. They disagreed because Shammai was somewhat like special forces, so that our listeners can understand, okay? So like only the elite could follow and worship and obey God at such a high level. And Shammai wanted to put this for the masses, that the masses had to raise their level up and follow and obey the will of God at such a high level. Yeah. But Hillel was saying, hey, come on, man, you can't expect the layman to do this, to do what you do, to live and obey and serve God at such a strict high level as an obligation on a day-to-day life. You can't expect that. We have to give him some leniency. So he was more so of, had a more of a liberal approach and bringing people in, at all costs. Okay. You'll find that for day-to-day life, Jesus agreed for the majority of his teachings, of his Torah teachings, he agreed with the school of Hillel. But so interesting is that there are certain matters that Jesus agreed with the school of Shammai. Yeah. For example, with divorce. The school of Hillel taught that you could get, this is all according to the oral tradition, that you could divorce your wife almost just according to, you could have many excuses why you could get divorced. But the school of Shammai taught that only for matters of sexual promiscuity or sexual immorality, that was the only reason why you could divorce your wife. And so Jesus teaches this way. He teaches that unless, someone seemingly thing is found in her some sexual immorality, you cannot divorce your wife for any other reason. And if a man divorced his wife for any other reason but that, he was committing transgression. Yeah. He's citing word for word with the school of Shammai.
Yeah.
See,
right? Yeah.
No, right. And the average Christian, the average reader is never going to get to that point, that depth. It's so superficial. I mean, I was there. I understand that. But I will tell you this, that once you step back and once you take a deep breath and you begin, it's like turning around at my desk and looking at my bookshelf now. If the days when I was in vocational ministry, if I turned around and looked at that bookshelf, it would have looked a whole lot different than it does today. But when I look back there's so much depth of understanding of what makes up Jesus and what makes up his teachings, his existence, where he connected, what brought about his understanding. And as that is pushed out further on into the New Testament writings, if you if you don't have that grasp of the Oral Torah, or you don't begin to make that understanding, then you're left with what the church has today. And that is so superficial, so small and minute, and so off track in its understanding. And we've seen this through history. It has and will always be dangerous, to the point where you're going to have people like myself that once you hear the truth spoken, and then once you begin to experiment and go in and understand and study that, you can't get enough of it. It draws you. It draws you like a weight that you've never picked up before, just deeper and deeper and deeper into that understanding.
That's a really good point. And I think it'd be good to kind of put this on the ground, right? Because we've covered this now, I think, pretty extensively. I always encourage people, come onto the Facebook page with any questions you have. Feel free to post it. But I look at it like this. So there was a story I heard a while ago, and I love this story. This comes back to me all the time. And Ray, you may have heard this one. There's a man who lived in the mountains, and he knew nothing about those who lived in the city. He sowed wheat, and he ate the kernels raw. And one day he entered the city, and they brought him bread, and he said, "What is this?" And they said, "It's bread to eat." And he ate it, and he said, "Wow, this is pretty good. What's it made of?" And they said, "It's made of wheat." And later he was brought cakes kneaded in oil, and he tasted them, and he said, what is this made of?" And they said, "It's wheat." You know, finally they brought him a pastry with honey and oil, and he said, "Oh wow, this is the best. What is this? What's this made of?" And they said, "It's wheat." And he said, I'm the master of all these, for I eat the essence of wheat. I eat the kernels raw." And what we're being taught is that I think there are people today who are eating the raw kernels, and they don't know what's available. And in the Jewish worldview, that parable is
Yeah.
taught that the wise are the ones who sow the wheat. They're the ones who find the depths of it, all the possibilities and the capabilities of the raw kernel. And I'm not into this so we can say, "Hey, we're right, you're wrong," or I'm not into this to argue. I'm interested in what we do here, because I think the world could really have a whole different approach to life and scripture if they understood these truths, and they could benefit from this millennia old stream of just amazing tradition. And so, and Ray, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this as well. Aside from jumping into, a study group, I would say for immediate resources, there's a website called Sepharia, and I love Sepharia.org. And you can go into Sepharia and you can start reading Genesis. And when you
Yeah.
click on any verse, you'll see a commentary. And on that commentary, you can start with someone named Rashi. We've mentioned him many times. But you can read what the Jewish commentary is. So go back through the Torah, start one book at a time, and just read the writings of Rashi. And you'll gain so much insight into historical culture, geographical,
Yes.
right? The plagues at Passover. Passover is coming up. Many people don't know that all of those plagues are an attack on 10 Egyptian deities, right? There's so much
Yep.
cultural stuff that you just don't get from reading, from as the parable says, eating the kernels raw. There's a lot that's missed. So that's my take.
Yeah. Yeah, man. I mean, I would want to end with a story, that I think sums it up pretty well, and even historically, what kind of has developed. And it goes like this: the two major schools of the Pharisees, Hillel and Shammai, and they both have a way of viewing the world, how should one, especially a layman, and in this, the most perfect layman and the perfect person to give this example to and to bring him in will be a non-Jew, right? So it's like this: a non-Jew comes and he comes to the great, sage Shammai, and he tells him, teach me the whole Torah while standing on one foot, which means teach me the written Torah without the oral. And so Shammai is like, what? And he grabs his cane and he chases him out of there. He's about to beat him up because Shammai is a zealot for God. He loves God. He wants to worship God, and he wants to worship God. And he's at a very, very high level. He can't accept that type of, you know, iffy, wishy-washy type of service, So he chases the convert out. Same convert goes to Hillel, and he tries the same thing, and he tells Hillel, hey man, listen, make me a convert, but you got to teach me the Torah while standing on one foot. So Hillel sees this guy, and he wants to bring him in, at all costs. So what he tells him is, he says, okay, I'll do it. And he starts by teaching him the Hebrew alphabet. And so he tells him, this is, this day, it's like this, man. Look, A, B, C. Okay, for our listeners, so we can understand. He starts teaching them the Hebrew alphabet. He tells them A, B, and C, And so the next day, okay, first lesson is on the way. He comes back the next day, the potential convert, this non-Jewish Gentile. He comes back the next day for his next lesson. And when he gets to Hillel, he says, okay, the second lesson, sir, here you go. C, B, A. The Gentile says, hey man, hold up. Yesterday you told me it was A, B, C. And so Hillel, very wise that he was, and you could see so much depth in this story. And I advise folks to try to look this up. He tells them, yesterday you relied upon me to teach you this Torah, and I told you this way, right? And you relied upon me. So you need to rely upon me today too, even though I went backwards. You need to rely on this oral transmission that it's here with us. I'm giving you the essence of the story because you don't get the essence of this story unless you read further on into the commentaries. But this is what he was telling this non-Jew. Yeah. Okay, you're relying on me to teach you this Torah. Okay, yes. But you need to rely on me in general because we have that oral transmission stemming all the way back from Moses.
Yeah, wonderful.
Wow.
And it's very interesting that it's a picture of the Jewish people who are the priests and teachers of God to the world, and it's a non-Jew coming in who still has this type of. This is the outlook and the viewpoint of all non-Jews towards Jewish people.
Yes.
This type of attitude.
Great story. Great point, man. What a great picture to kind of bring it together and to take it out. Hillel kind of reminds me of the school of Miyagi, in the Karate Kid. Wax on, wax off. You do it just like. Hey guys, let me tell you, fantastic study, fantastic thoughts. I think maybe an upcoming episode would be really cool to do if we looked at some resources that we could turn our listeners on to and maybe talk about them a little bit and how they could be helpful. And for a lot of people, just beginning to think about these things and beginning to think about, okay, well, how do I get turned on? What do I need to begin this process? Because I went through that same phase myself. And so maybe down the road here real soon, we'll do an episode on that. But as far as this particular set, these two episodes here, I think you guys did a phenomenal job, brought a lot to the table. I'm going to give you an opportunity to say something to close it out with, and then we'll close this episode out. James, you have anything you want to add to it?
Yeah, I think the information we've given in these episodes, it's a lot. So yeah, by all means, reach out to us. If you can find us on Facebook, just message us, leave a message at the Rethinking Faith podcast page. Let's keep the dialogue going. If you have a question, by all means ask, because this is not easy information right? You're changing paradigms, and that doesn't happen easily, and it doesn't happen in isolation. So we're here to answer questions and help point people to resources. If you enjoyed this, let us know. Reach out to us. Share with a friend. We love watching the podcast grow. We also love the messages. We've been getting some really nice messages from different parts of the world, and that's very powerful. Reach out to us through the week. We'd be glad to kind of give more information and resources.
Good job. Thank you, James. What about you, Ray? You got anything you want to say, buddy?
Oh yeah, man. I'm just very appreciative, to be here with you guys, and to our listeners, we appreciate the feedback, and we want to just continue to put out the best content that we can over there and share what we've been able to learn, and other, so I know I'm indebted first of all to God and to some of my teachers, rabbis, and other types of teachers that I have throughout my life, who have helped me along the way. And so it's almost like a responsibility that you want to give back. This information is not for me just to acquire information, but first and foremost that we be able to serve God correctly and humbly, and also to help others along the way. So this is what we're here for.
Thank you, Ray. And as we close this out, guys, we had a couple of comments and feedbacks from the episode we just did before that was absolutely amazing. And so it's amazing when you do give us feedback, and whether it's good, bad, or you're trying to understand something. Join the Facebook page, Rethinking Faith. You can always subscribe to the YouTube channel, Rethinking Faith, and then of course also these episodes here. We appreciate you taking your time out, and as James said, we welcome questions, we welcome feedback. Again, just from myself, blessings on your families out there, and thank you again for taking the time to listen to us, and we hope to see you all again soon. So take care.